The morning the nightmare began did not look like the beginning of anything tragic. It looked ordinary, almost too ordinary, the kind of calm that later feels like a warning no one recognized in time. Two girls walked along the dusty outskirts of a quiet South African town, sunlight spilling across their path, laughter echoing as if the world was still innocent. They had no reason to feel afraid, no reason to sense the shadow watching them from a distance, no reason to know that by nightfall everything they understood about safety would be shattered forever. There is always a moment where life tilts and never returns to balance. For them, it arrived silently. Far behind them, a white bakkie idled near the edge of the road, its engine humming beneath the breeze. Inside sat a man whose name would later become a symbol of horror. Johannes Hansie Mowers, a convicted predator, a man who had already perfected the art of disappearing people, a man who blended into small towns so easily that neighbors simply called him quiet, polite, harmless. Behind his controlled expression lived a darkness so old it felt rehearsed. The girls did not see the danger, because real monsters rarely look like monsters. Their families recall that afternoon with a kind of internal tearing, remembering the normalcy, the way the girls joked about school, the way they asked what was for dinner, the way they promised to be home before sunset, ordinary moments that would later feel like the final breaths of their childhood. As the girls walked, the bakkie crept closer, slow enough to avoid suspicion, steady enough to be predatory. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just a quiet shift in proximity, a shadow folding into their world. Later, investigators would replay this path over and over, tracing footprints, tire marks, and the faint imprint of inevitability that everyone missed. They would note how silent abductions often are. No screams, no witnesses, just absence, a terrifying, hollow absence. When the girls did not return home that evening, the first reaction was confusion. Maybe they stopped at a friend's house, maybe they lost track of time, maybe it was nothing, but mothers feel danger differently. The first hour brought unease, the second brought fear, the third brought the kind of panic that claws at the throat. Families searched the streets with flashlights. Their voices echoed across open fields, calling names that would never be answered. Neighbors joined, forming circles of light in the darkness. And slowly, as the night grew deeper, a horrifying possibility took shape in everyone's mind. Something was terribly wrong. Police were notified, though few expected the case to be urgent. Two missing girls often leads to assumptions. Maybe they ran away. Maybe they stayed with friends. Maybe they would return on their own. But the mothers knew. They insisted. They pleaded. They demanded urgency. By midnight, officers began combing through the town. They found nothing, no footprints, no clothing, no signs of struggle. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Beneath the surface, that assumption was closer to the truth than anyone realized. While the world searched above ground, the girls lay unconscious below it. Hansie Mowers had already driven them to the outskirts of the region, an area he knew no one visited. An empty plot of land, a rusted shed, a place no one questioned. Beneath that shed, hidden under old metal sheets and layers of soil, he had constructed something far more sinister than a hiding place. A bunker, narrow, suffocating, cold, a place that smelled of damp concrete and old secrets, a place built not for survival, but for captivity. When the girls awoke, darkness greeted them like a solid wall. No windows, no clocks, just the sound of water dripping somewhere behind the metal door. Fear arrived instantly, settling into their bones before their minds could comprehend the situation. Above ground, morning approached. The search widened. Flyers were printed. Community groups mobilized. Mothers refused to sleep. Fathers walked fields until their feet blistered. The entire town pulsed with desperation. Every day, without answers, tightened the noose around hope. Investigators began reviewing past offenders in the region. One name surfaced early: Johannes Hansie Mowers, a man with a history of sexual offenses, a man who had moved quietly from place to place, a man who always seemed to vanish when authorities looked too closely. When officers visited his property, he appeared calm, courteous, cooperative, too cooperative. He claimed he knew nothing. He claimed he had been home all day. He claimed he barely left his property. His eyes never left the officers' faces, as if rehearsing innocence. The officers left without a search warrant, a mistake that would haunt them. Meanwhile, inside the bunker, the girls counted seconds in darkness. Their world had shrunk to 4 concrete walls and the sound of metal scraping whenever their captor returned. Time lost meaning, days bled into nights, nights bled into nightmares. Their whispers became their only comfort, their only rebellion against silence. The community continued searching, clinging to fragments of hope. But whispers began spreading. Maybe the girls crossed the border. Maybe they were taken elsewhere. Maybe they were no longer alive. One of the mothers refused to believe it. Her grief sharpened into certainty. She felt something was being overlooked, something close, something familiar. She began retracing every road, every abandoned path, every rural property. And one evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, she paused outside the rusted shed near Mowers' land. She had never noticed it before. It looked empty, nothing suspicious, yet something about the stillness felt wrong, too controlled, too quiet. She stepped closer. The air around the shed felt colder, heavier, as though something beneath it breathed. She placed her hand on the metal door and heard it, a faint thud, followed by another, then silence. Her body froze, the blood draining from her face. She leaned closer, holding her breath. Then she heard it again, a soft, trembling tap beneath the ground. Not wind, not animals, not imagination, a human sound. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Someone was underneath. The girls, she knew it. She felt it deep in her soul. She stepped back, trembling as terror and hope collided inside her. And just as she turned to run for help, a quiet realization hit her like a knife. Someone else had heard the noise too, Hansie Mowers. He stood several meters behind her, watching in complete silence, his expression unreadable, his presence suffocating, his intentions unknown. The mother froze, staring at the man who might be holding her child underground. And in that unnerving stillness, she understood one horrifying truth. She was no longer supposed to be here, the shed, the bunker, the noise. She had discovered something she was never meant to find. And Mowers knew it. His next step toward her shattered the fragile illusion of safety around them. The air tightened around the mother as Hansie Mowers took a single, deliberate step closer, not fast, not aggressive, slow, calculated, the kind of movement that warned anyone who understood danger that they were standing on the edge of something irreversible. The mother's breath trembled in her chest. Every instinct screamed to run, but her legs felt pinned by fear. She stared at him, trying to read his expression, searching for even a flicker of humanity. There was none, just a cold, patient stillness, the stillness of a man who had controlled every moment of this nightmare for nearly 2 years. Without speaking, he lifted his chin as if acknowledging what she had discovered. The shed, the noise, the truth rising from the earth. For the first time since the abductions, the darkness below ground had been heard, and Hansie knew that meant his control was slipping. The mother took a shaky step backward. It was instinctive, but enough to snap the fragile silence. Hansie's eyes narrowed, and he moved toward her, faster now, with a sudden urgency that sent panic surging through her body. She turned and ran. Her hands tore through the tall grass as she sprinted toward the road. Her lungs burned. Her heart pounded like a warning bell. Behind her, she could hear him closing the distance, but she didn't dare look back. All she knew was that if she stopped, even for a second, no one would ever know what she heard. No one would ever find the bunker. No one would ever save the girls. Her foot struck a rock, sending her stumbling forward. Pain shot through her ankle, but she pushed onward. The road came into view, a thin strip of gravel that felt like salvation, and just as she reached it, headlights appeared, a passing vehicle. Hope flared in her chest. She waved frantically, screaming for help. The driver slowed, startled by the sight of a terrified woman running out of the brush. He rolled down his window, confusion turning to concern as he saw Hansie emerge from the shadows behind her. The moment he recognized danger, he opened the passenger door. The mother dove in. The driver hit the accelerator. Hansie stopped pursuing, watching as the car sped away, dust billowing behind it like a final goodbye. He had been inches away from silencing the only witness who knew where to find his underground world, but it was already too late. The mother clutched her shaking hands together as she begged the driver to take her to the nearest police station. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but her certainty did not. She told them she heard something. She told them she was sure. She told them the girls were there. Investigators listened with growing intensity. Fear, hope, disbelief, a storm of emotions collided within the room. This time they didn't hesitate. A convoy of police vehicles raced toward Hansie Mowers' property. Officers armed with flashlights, rifles, and urgency fanned across the land. The shed stood exactly where the mother described it, silent and unremarkable, but beneath the surface, life waited in darkness. Officers pried open the shed door. Inside, they found nothing unusual. Rusted tools, old crates, a floor of compacted dirt. But one officer noticed something strange. The ground felt hollow under his boots. He knelt down and brushed away loose soil. Metal gleamed back at him. A hatch, heartbeats quickened, hands shook. Flashlights gathered around the discovery. They pulled the hatch open. A blast of stale, suffocating air rose from the darkness. It smelled of damp confinement and forgotten oxygen. And then, faintly, beneath the sound of shifting hinges, a fragile noise reached them, a whimper. Hope turned into adrenaline. Officers descended the narrow staircase, their beams cutting through the pitch black. At the bottom, the bunker stretched out like a tomb, concrete walls, a small bed, faded blankets, scratched markings on the surfaces, the remnants of survival carved into the environment. Then they saw them. Two girls, fragile, thin, pale from months without sunlight, eyes wide with disbelief as the first light in years touched their faces. They did not cry out. They did not rush forward. They simply stared, trembling, unsure if the world returning to them was real or another cruel illusion. The officers approached gently, their voices calm, their movements slow. They wrapped the girls in blankets and lifted them up the staircase. Each step they took toward the surface was a step back into existence, out of the nightmare that had swallowed them whole. Above ground, the mother who had heard the noise collapsed to her knees the moment the girls emerged. Her sobs filled the air with a kind of broken relief that jerked through every bystander's heart. The news spread instantly. 2 missing girls, found alive, inside a bunker no one imagined could exist. But the relief was short-lived, because Hansie Mowers was gone. He had vanished from the property sometime between the mother escaping and the police arriving. No footprints, no vehicle tracks, no signs of direction. The man responsible for nearly 2 years of torment had slipped into the shadows again. Investigators swarmed the region, turning over every possible lead. They traced his past addresses, his criminal record, his known associates, and with each discovery, a disturbing pattern emerged. Hansie never acted impulsively. He planned. He scouted. He prepared hiding places long before he took victims. The bunker was not his first, just the first they found. Forensic teams uncovered signs of old construction, pits on other properties he once owned, raising horrifying questions about other possible victims. Names from old case files resurfaced. Missing persons reports were pulled back into the spotlight. A larger, darker truth began forming. Hansie Mowers was not just a man who abducted 2 girls. He was a predator with a history of disappearing people long before anyone realized. Meanwhile, the rescued girls were transported to a nearby hospital. Doctors watched their heart rates spike whenever doors closed or footsteps echoed. Trauma ran deep in their eyes. The mere sound of a metal latch made them flinch. The darkness had changed them. Their silence carried the weight of things no child should ever hold. Days passed as psychologists worked to gently guide them through fragments of memory. Slowly, bits of the nightmare came to light. What he did, how he controlled them, how he manipulated them with fear and dependency, how he taught them that no one was searching, how he made them believe the world above had already forgotten them. Every detail sharpened the urgency to catch him. Investigators pieced together a timeline of his movements, but something kept slipping through the cracks, a missing detail, a blind spot. Then a breakthrough came unexpectedly. A security camera footage from a gas station surfaced. A blurry image, a familiar face, a timestamp from hours after the girls were found. Hansie Mowers had fled toward a rural highway leading deeper into the interior. He was not hiding, he was regrouping, and tucked into the corner of the footage was something far worse. The back of his vehicle appeared heavier, weighted, as if something else or someone else was inside. The girls were not his last victims. He had taken others, and investigators realized the nightmare was far from over. Because Hansie Mowers had not run from justice, he was preparing for something bigger. The security footage became the turning point investigators had been desperate for. A grainy image of Hansie Mowers, moving with a calmness that felt unnervingly deliberate. The bakkie he drove sagged under extra weight, the rear door slightly unlatched, as though someone had tried to push it open. A silent message from inside, a plea for help caught only by accident. It shattered the illusion that the bunker had been the end of his crimes. It was merely one chapter in a pattern far older and far darker. Authorities mounted the largest manhunt the region had seen in years. Roadblocks formed along the rural highways. Helicopters traced the dust trails that cut across open fields. Officers combed through abandoned farms and empty storage lots. Hansie had always been skilled at disappearing, but this time the world was watching. Survivors from his past cases began coming forward, faces aged by trauma, voices trembling with memories they never believed would matter again. Each testimony added weight to the growing understanding that Hansie was not a man acting on impulse, but a predator who built his life around precision and concealment. The recovered girls, still fragile but determined, provided fragmented details of other voices they occasionally heard through vents in the bunker. Voices crying, voices begging, voices that were silenced too quickly. Somewhere out there, someone else was still alive. Investigators knew the next hours could decide everything. One detail from the footage stood out. The direction Hansie fled toward was a route leading to a remote cluster of decommissioned mines, a sprawling labyrinth of tunnels abandoned decades earlier. If Hansie wanted to vanish, this was the perfect place, silent, unmapped, forgotten. A tactical team was assembled. Officers, forensic trackers, and trauma specialists prepared for what they might find underground. They moved quickly, guided by the possibility of saving another life. At the entrance of the first mine, the air was still. Dust floated in thin beams of sunlight. No footprints, no fresh tire marks. Nothing unusual, but deep inside the tunnel, a faint metallic echo vibrated through the walls. A rhythmic tapping, weak, irregular, human. The team followed it, their flashlights cutting through darkness thicker than night itself. Old support beams creaked under the weight of silence. The smell of rust and cold earth wrapped around them. The tapping grew louder. Then they saw it. A makeshift barricade built from rusted metal sheets. Behind it, a small figure curled in the shadows, a boy, barely 12 years old, thin, terrified, barely conscious. He had been held there, hidden, saved for something unspeakable. He was alive, but Hansie Mowers was nowhere in sight. The rescue of the boy ignited a new wave of urgency. This was more than proof of another victim. This was evidence that Hansie was using the mines as temporary holding sites, that he planned, that he moved victims like supplies. And somewhere deeper inside the system of tunnels, he was still lurking. Officers pressed forward, sweeping each branching corridor. Every sound carried weight. Every corner threatened the possibility of sudden violence. They moved steadily, methodically, surrounding the deeper chambers. Then a shout broke through the darkness. A flashlight beam had caught movement. A figure slipping between shadows, worn boots, a familiar stride. Hansie, he darted deeper into the mines, weaving through the narrow passages like someone who knew them intimately. The chase erupted, echoing violently through the underground world. Officers sprinted after him, the beam of their lights bouncing wildly along the walls. Hansie reached a lower chamber, only to find a dead end, a collapsed shaft, fields of broken stone blocking his escape. For the first time he looked cornered. The officers advanced, weapons raised, their commands sharp and resolute. Hansie lifted his hands slowly, his expression unreadable. His face held no panic, no regret, no fear, only a chilling calm, as though he believed he still held the upper hand. But then something shifted. One of the rescued girls had insisted on being present near the mine entrance, her voice trembling but firm. She said she needed to know the man who stole years of her life would never hurt anyone again. When news reached her that Hansie had been trapped inside, she stood at the entrance among officers, fragile but unbroken, shaking with emotion she had carried in silence for too long. Inside the chamber, Hansie watched the approaching officers and realized the world he controlled for so long was slipping entirely from his grasp. The mines, the tunnels, the secrecy, all of it collapsing. He took one final step backward, the ground beneath him crumbled, the old shaft gave way, rocks shifting under decades of weight. Officers lunged forward, but it was too late. Hansie Mowers fell. The earth swallowed him in a violent crash of stone and dust. A poetic collapse for a man who had buried others in darkness. It took hours to reach the fallen section, but when officers finally moved aside enough debris to search for him, they found what justice so often requires. Hansie Mowers was gone, not escaped, ended, crushed beneath the very underground he had used to trap others. The world above would never again fear his shadow. The boy rescued from the mine was carried out into sunlight he had not seen in months. The two girls who survived the bunker were waiting nearby under the watch of medical staff. When the boy lifted his eyes and saw them, something soft and fractured passed between them. 3 children connected by tragedy. 3 survivors bound by darkness, they escaped together. 3 lives reclaimed from a man who believed no one would ever find them. The mine entrance became a gathering place for officers, medical teams, and the families who had prayed without rest. Tears flowed freely. Relief trembled through the air. The mother, who had heard the tapping beneath the shed, held her daughter's trembling hands with a strength that came from surviving the worst possible fear. In the weeks that followed, South Africa would call the case one of the darkest in its history. But within that darkness, the resilience of the survivors became an unstoppable force. Therapists worked patiently. Families rebuilt trust. Communities united. The girl slowly relearned the sky. The boy relearned laughter. And the shadow that once ruled their lives dissolved into the past. Justice had taken a shape no courtroom could provide. Not by verdict, not by sentence, but by a collapse of stone that sealed the fate of a man who believed he would never be caught. In the end, the survivors stood beneath a wide South African sunrise. The light washed over their faces, gentle and warm, touching the parts of them that darkness once claimed. And as the wind carried across the open fields, the world felt quiet again, safe again. Their nightmare had ended. But their story, their courage, and their survival would echo for generations. Like a final shot in a film, the camera pulls back, revealing the land that once hid unspeakable horrors, now untouched, now silent, now free.